Hello everyone and welcome to Module 4 of our English Literature Foundation course, Intro to Shakespeare. So we'll first start by looking at 6 important facts about Shakespeare, and then we'll move on to looking at a chronology of Shakespeare's major plays, and finally I'm going to give you some top tips for reading Shakespeare as you go forward to explore his works. But first, let's take a look at who William Shakespeare is. Shakespeare was born in 1564 and he died in 1616, aged 52. He was born in the Renaissance period, but in historical terms, he was active between the Elizabethan and the Jacobean periods. So Elizabethan refers to Elizabeth I's reign, and Jacobean refers to James I's reign. So he was born in Stratford upon Avon in England, and he is of course nicknamed the Bard, which we continue to refer to him today. His primary profession, as we all know, was a playwright, a poet and an actor, but as we'll go on to see, his scope of occupation actually expanded beyond these. So of course he's famous for being viewed as arguably the greatest writer in the English language and arguably the world's most widely known dramatist. Why do we still care about him? Well, if you're studying English literature, you have to care about him because virtually every English student has to study Shakespeare's plays for school. But of course, in terms of his cultural currency, there is no denying that it continues to be super relevant because his works and his plays continue to be staged and adapted into films all around the world. Some of his most famous works include Romeo and Juliet, Macbeth, Hamlet, A Midsummer Night's Dream, King Lear, etc. So, let's dive straight into topic 1. 6 important facts about Shakespeare. Fact 1. He wore multiple hats. Being a playwright was just one. As a core member of his dramatic troupe, which was originally called Lord Chamberlain's Men, but later renamed to the King's Men after James I's ascension to the throne in 1603, Shakespeare was both artistically and financially invested in the success of his plays. He wasn't just a writer who wrote plays and poems, he was also an actor for at least until 1603, which again happens to be the year when James I ascended to the throne. He was also an entrepreneur and an investor. And specifically, he invested in Stratford Tights and properties in London and Stratford, so he owned properties in both places. He also owned the shares of his dramatic troupe from as early as 1594, presumably with the help and patronage of his then sponsor, Henry Wriothesley, the Earl of Southampton. And you can see both men in the image on the right, which happens to be a 19th century impression of Shakespeare and his friends at the Mermaid Tavern. Fact 2. Shakespeare was married, but he was actually very progressive in terms of his gender explorations. So Shakespeare married a woman called Anne Hathaway. It was probably a shotgun wedding because by the time they got married, Hathaway was already pregnant with their first child, Susanna. Hathaway was also 8 years older than Shakespeare, and together they had 3 children, Susanna, Hamnet, and Judith. For the majority of Shakespeare's professional life, though, they lived apart. There is speculation as to whether their marriage was loveless and unhappy. And actually in Shakespeare's will, he stated that he would leave behind my second best bed to his wife. To this day, this remark remains rather cryptic. So despite his traditional marriage though, Shakespeare's sexual orientation has remained a point of lively controversial debate among scholars, with some suggesting that he had occasional affairs with female playgoers and others drawing on his sonnet sequence as signs of bisexual tendencies. And in his sonnet sequence, the character, the fair youth, whom the speaker often addresses, is considered to be his sponsor, Henry Wriothesley, the Earl of Southampton. Gender fluidity is an often explored topic in Shakespearean plays anyway. And back in the Bard's time, what's interesting is that female roles were all played by male actors because women were, of course, not allowed to partake in theatre. Fact 3. He often borrowed from other works. Now, while no one would deny that Shakespeare was a creative genius, the playwright often sourced his plots from other texts. So you can call it imitation or inspiration, but one thing's for sure: the stories in Shakespeare's plays are, in fact, rarely original. So let's now take a look at some of Shakespeare's major source texts and authors. There's the Latin comedies by Plautus and Terence, revenge tragedies by Seneca, medieval miracle plays, Raphael Holinshed's Chronicles of England, Scotland and Ireland, Italian comedies, and Ovid and Virgil's narrative poems. Fact 4. His plays fall within 5 main genres. So on the whole, those 5 main categories are comedies, tragedies, histories, romances, and problem plays. Comedies often portray romantic relationships that result in marriage, an example being A Midsummer Night's Dream. Tragedies deal with men of high station who fall from grace and end in death, an example being Hamlet. Histories are dramatic representations of historical events, and they often chronicle the reigns of British kings, Henry V being one. Romances are plays which are quite generically fluid, and they often fuse comedic and tragic elements, an example being The Tempest. Finally, you have the problem plays, and these plays often defy the conventions of all other genres. And what's distinctive about them is that they often explore darker themes in human nature. An example here would be Troilus and Cressida. Fact 5. Shakespeare actually wrote for the masses. Nowadays, we're probably going to think of Shakespeare as highbrow literature, but back in Shakespeare's own time, he was actually writing for the masses, and his plays were a key source of popular entertainment, much like TV shows in our own time. The Globe, which is where the King's Men would stage their plays, was frequently packed with playgoers, and Shakespeare's history plays were especially popular with the crowds. Whereas the Globe catered more towards a mass audience, the Blackfriars was a more upscale and exclusive theatre, where Shakespeare's troupe started performing from 1608 to 1609 in the later years. Fact 6. Shakespeare wrote primarily for the stage. Now, it's really important that I remember, except for his narrative poems and sonnet sequence, Shakespeare wrote primarily for the stage. And while this may seem obvious because we know him by his plays, we must remember that we're not just reading his plays as written texts, but rather as theatrical performances. So performance was always the priority. But in terms of publication, the first official publication of his plays was released in 1623 by his King's Men's colleagues John Hemming and Henry Condell, and this version is now commonly referred to as the 1623 folio, which you can see here on the right is a very famous collector's item. But previous to 1623, all of Shakespeare's plays were published in either the quarto or the octavo format. Let's now take a look at a chronology of Shakespeare's major works. So as you can see, starting from 1594, you had Romeo and Juliet as one of the earliest plays, followed by A Midsummer Night's Dream, and then The Merchant of Venice, and then Julius Caesar in 1599. All the plays here in this group, you would categorize them as Elizabethan plays, as plays that were written during Elizabeth I's reign. But starting from 1603 onwards, which, as you'll remember, is the year when Elizabeth I dies and James I ascends the throne, we see plays that are considerably darker, with the main tragedies Othello, King Lear, and Macbeth all being produced between the years 1603 to 1606. In 1609, you had the publication of the sonnets, but the writing of the sonnets actually preceded 1609. It was only in 1609 that these were published, and then in 1611, you had The Tempest. And all of the plays post 1603, we would refer to them as Jacobean plays, being works that were written during James I's reign. So now let's dive into some of the top tips for reading Shakespeare. First, get to know the plot. Remember, Shakespeare was always sourcing his stories from existing texts. And so with Shakespeare, the story is actually never the main point. Rather, it's all about his mastery of language and dramaturgy. Always start by understanding what exactly is going on in the plot and then use that as your starting point to really begin exploring and getting to grips with what makes Shakespeare Shakespeare. Second, you want to look up the meaning of words in an early modern English glossary. My personal recommendation is shakespeareswords.com, which I think is a very comprehensive early modern English dictionary. As we know, with Shakespearean plays, often the words don't mean the same thing as they mean today. That's why it's really important that we clarify what they mean in their original context. So number 3, always remember, Shakespeare's works are fundamentally concerned with universal themes and human nature, like love, jealousy, ambition, fear, etc., which is exactly why his works continue to be studied and are so timeless. The characters aren't that different from us, so don't be put off by the unfamiliarity of his language and just approach the characters as if they were characters you'd find in a 21st century novel, or even people that you would encounter in our daily lives. And tip number 4, close read the language of his plays as if they were poetry, but again, never forget that these plays were intended first and foremost for stage performance. So you should always consider the theatrical aspect of his works. So ask yourself, how would an actor perform certain lines? How would the actors move across the stage at a given moment? And are there any meta-theatrical references? Meta-theatrical here meaning any lines that refer to the practice of acting, refer to the nature of theatre, etc., etc. For example, you have the line, "All the world's a stage," and that's exactly an example of a meta-theatrical reference. Okay, next up, don't just read his plays, watch them. But you want to opt for theatrical productions over cinematic ones, meaning films. Because with films, sometimes they diverge quite a lot from the original plot. So unless you're very familiar with the plot already and you're able to spot those areas of divergence, I would suggest that you go for the theatrical productions instead, because they tend to be more faithful adaptations of Shakespeare's plays. RSC, Royal Shakespeare Company Live Online, is a trusty resource, but it requires paid subscription. I don't think it's very expensive. It's definitely a trusty and reliable resource. Next up, pay attention to wordplay. Shakespeare was a big fan of puns. So watch out for repeated words, because these repeated words often carry different and sometimes risque meanings. So the next tip is to equip yourself with both the print and digital copies of Shakespeare's plays. So with print, you can always annotate and color code with your highlighters and pens, but with digital, you can easily look up keywords simply by pressing Ctrl F to quickly source the relevant quotations that you need. And this can come in super handy when you are looking up quotes for a specific theme or topic. And my final tip is to approach Shakespeare by considering how he reappropriated and challenged his source text. So this may be more of an advanced tip, because it requires you to actually do some research into all of those source texts that we spoke about, the Senecan revenge plays, the medieval miracle plays, the Latin comedies, etc. But if you do manage to do your research on them, then it would be really, really impressive if you can consider how Shakespeare reworked those source plays and often humanized the representation in these plays through his characterization of his tragic heroes and his characters. So finally, here are some useful resources that I figured would be helpful. Wikipedia and No Fear Shakespeare are always going to be helpful if you're just starting out with Shakespeare and you just want a general understanding of what's going on in the plot of the plays. Definitely no shame in turning to these websites. And then, of course, Shakespearean Dictionary. As I mentioned, shakespeareswords.com is my personal favorite. For a version of an easily navigable kind of HTML styled presentation of his full-length plays, I recommend the MIT resource, where they basically archive all of Shakespeare's plays and it's really, really handy, especially if you want to do that Control F exercise to quickly look up specific words for quotes. And then finally, Royal Shakespeare's Company, RSC's About Shakespeare section is a great intro and primer to all things Shakespeare. And finally, here are 4 critics that I recommend for any sort of Shakespearean studies. We've got Stephen Greenblatt, Emma Smith, Marjorie Garber, and David Bevington. I recommend their books, and specifically these titles that I've listed, if you want an academic level study of Shakespeare.